Are you living in a state of housing stress? We know the situation well here at Life Matters. Rent or the mortgage takes up over half of many household budgets, even more sometimes, leaving the purse strings very tight for other essential expenses, let alone entertainment. Where you choose to live has an impact, obviously. Living in a capital city is usually very expensive in Australia now, but it can reduce the cost of your commute to work. Living outside of or on the peripheral of a city is usually cheaper, but commutes are cumbersome then, and employment opportunities more limited. The genuine crisis of housing affordability and availability, that's key, isn't going to go away unless we do something about it. Brian Haratsis is the Managing Director and Chief Economist at Macro Plan Australia. He has an idea and he'd like to canvass it. It involves making land available to first home buyers on the urban fringe. Welcome to Life Matters, Brian.
Good morning, Natasha.
In a nutshell, Brian, what is the idea that you're proposing here?
In a nutshell, the idea is that people would have access to a block of land, that's a first home buyer, access to a block of land for free for 10 years, at which point in time they must either purchase, sell or rent the block of land on which they've put a dwelling. Now, the rationale behind this is that the initial mortgage would be half a traditional mortgage because
you're not paying for land.
Correct. So what happens is your ingoing cost is 50% lower and your debt servicing costs are 20% lower.
Okay, so nothing's free here, Brian. So someone has to pay for the land at some point. You're saying the first homeowners do it 10 years down the track. Who does it initially, though? Who's buying the land from who?
Well, what we do is divert money which is already being spent on the National Rental Assistance Scheme. So in the last 10 years, $4.5 billion was spent on that, and there's another $5 billion on first homeowner schemes. So what I'm saying is, instead of those schemes, because the first homeowner schemes, for example, the money just gets wrapped into the cost of the dwelling. Developers and builders just charge more. So what we need a scheme that is no more expensive than what we already do. So this is the scheme. It will be no more expensive than what we currently do, but we only need to fund it once, because after 10 years, the land needs to be purchased and that money is recycled. So we've got a circulating amount of capital.
What you're suggesting here is that the Commonwealth purchases land from private developers through a kind of long-term supply contract. Is that right?
That's absolutely correct.
And then the Commonwealth then passes the debt on to the first homeowner 10 years down the track. I mean, 10 years is an awful long time to be perhaps living on the periphery of a city.
That's right. So the idea is that the homeowner would be able to sell whenever they wish. So they're not locked in. It's like a first homeowner's grant today. You take the first homeowner's grant, you can still buy and sell the property. So the idea, and the other part of this is an incentive for people to get into a housing market. But the idea is that if you wished to build a house on the land and rent it to a third party so that you, in fact, could move somewhere else because you had to because of your job, that's fine too. What this is all about is creating access to housing for first homeowners. It's such a huge problem in Australia. I don't know if your listeners now know, but last week Demographia International put out this International Housing Survey again. Australia is the most unaffordable country in the world. According to the Economist magazine, houses are 45% higher than they should be in Australia today, and we have 8 of the top 20 least affordable housing markets in the world. This is a crisis.
And don't we know it? Some of us very much know this, and it is a genuine crisis. I mean, you've canvassed this idea, you're canvassing this idea, it needs Commonwealth and private sector interest. What sort of response have you had so far from developers and government to your idea?
Well, the private sector, it's been enormous, to be honest with you. I've been actually shocked. One of the things that's been very interesting in this sort of so-called shadow election campaign is that affordable housing, Julia Gillard, Tony Abbott, haven't really put forward any central policies. And yet, if you were in Western Sydney or if you're in the west of Melbourne, housing cost, the crisis in housing cost and living costs is so bad that you would think. And so you see, so what's happened is the private sector have jumped at this as a good idea.
Your company, though, advises on new property development projects. So we have to be clear, do you have a personal investment in this?
No, none at all. None whatsoever. My idea here is that this is a financing item from a federal government that shifts money from one project to another. And the thing I'd also ask you both yourself and your listeners is that even if this project or program or idea isn't the right one, there needs to be a program or a project which reduces housing costs.
Well, that's the National Rental Affordability Scheme in place right now, though, isn't it? And that offers the business sector and community organisations effectively tax incentives to build and rent dwellings to low and moderate income households at below market rates for 10 years. And that's, many would argue, just hitting its stride as a policy measure.
There's two things about that scheme. The first one is it hasn't actually done much yet. So, and it's been around for nearly 5 years. And there's a place for it, but that's not going to lead us down the path of home ownership. If you want to be a nation of renters, if we really believe this is just all about rental, then I think we're not understanding the culture and the psyche of Australians. We have more land per capita in Australia than anywhere else in the world. This is a failure at all levels of government to plan and govern Australia. There is no land shortage. There never will be a land shortage. The rental schemes are okay for rental. We need ownership schemes which bring the cost of land down.
You're assuming, Brian, that first home buyers will want to live on the urban fringe. That can be moving a big distance, involve moving with your families a big distance away from communities, away from good work. Public transport can be appalling, and also there's always the risk of exacerbating urban sprawl. I guess that's a really genuine concern, isn't it?
No, it's not, because as I said with the scheme, you are allocated a block of land. You don't have to live on it. You can build a house and rent it out to a third party, because there will be all sorts of situations as there are today with first homeowner schemes where people will want to move for work, because there's two central issues in planning these days. It's access to employment and it's an affordable shelter.
And getting to the employment from the affordable shelter.
but you see, so what I'm saying is you don't actually have to live on the urban fringe. You can actually build the house and just rent it and then use the rental money yourself to rent something else. But the idea is to get you access into a housing market. So it's more subtle than you're putting, Natasha. And
urban fringe, I find it a sort of fairly appalling term, because many people listening will be living on a so-called urban fringe and it's the centre of their universe.
Absolutely. Well, that's absolutely right. I mean, I'm on the Ministerial Advisory Committee in Victoria for the new Metropolitan Strategy, and the central issue, one of our central themes, is what we call the 20-minute city. And the idea is that there should be access, walking, cycling and public transport access within 20 minutes for all facilities.
Great in theory, less the case in reality.
Well, it is, but you know, this is just a failure of governance, because there are no reasons why we can't achieve it. None. It's just a failure of governance. Thinking
about this model of essentially the government buying land off private developers and then giving it for free for 10 years at least to young homeowners, and it is the first homeowners and a particular age range that you're looking at here, isn't it?
Correct, that's right.
Is there a potential for young homeowners to then over-invest in their homes, given that the land is initially free for at least that first decade?
Well, in theory, yes, but a key part of my scheme is that you would need to attend an educational seminar or seminars, probably on an annual basis, to understand where you are. It is very interesting, given how important the housing investment decision is. It's interesting how little information people actually have about the levels of investability and the relative levels of long-term return. So there needs to be an educational component that goes along with this. And for example, as you have pointed out, understanding if a potential owner was to live in a location, what the commute costs would be. We need to help people to understand living costs in total, not just housing costs.
Brian Haratsis is my guest this morning on Life Matters, Managing Director and Chief Economist of Microplan Australia. He's got an idea for increasing the availability and affordability of homes, purchasing homes for first home buyers, and he's canvassing it on Life Matters this morning. You know, here you have, Brian, government pouring money into property developer bank accounts, I guess, and one might ask, would they, the property developers, likely end up making more money than anyone else here?
Well, you know, you mentioned the National Rental Affordability Scheme before. And if you've got a problem with private developers, you'd have a problem with the National Rental Scheme as well, because money went to private developers in there as well. There seemed to be no problem with that. In the same way...
And that like this is a public-private partnership, which
correct.
Is perhaps the only way these things are going to happen.
That's right. And so this scheme is no different. It's a public-private partnership with the prime objective of home ownership as distinct from rental. So in essence, it's the same balance.
Yes, it's interesting. Have you actually costed this out, thinking about those schemes that are in place, the National Rental Affordability Scheme, the various first home buyer schemes which are different across Australia depending on the state? Have you costed it out as being more effective, more cost effective than those two schemes combined?
Yes, we have. So our numbers would suggest that if you put those two projects together, it would be more cost effective over a 10-year time frame, but even more, this scheme funds itself over time.
And how many houses are you talking about here? The National Rental Affordability Scheme is funded for up to 50,000 homes, I think.
That's right. That's right. We think that the number, depending on people's take up now, of course, you know, we can't predict exactly how many people would want to take up the offer, but we would be thinking that there might be somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 people or households taking up this kind of offer on an annual basis.
Which is barely enough, isn't it, given the population growth in Australia that's projected?
Oh, absolutely. It is barely enough. But it's a start, and when we get to projects which begin to reduce prices, and you see the difference between this scheme and other schemes, is that if there's long-term purchase of land, then there can be a price dampening effect on land. So what can happen is, for example, if a government was to have a long-term supply contract, they can require the contract not to have price increases. We need to dampen the national hobby of land speculation. We've got to get people's minds around the idea that housing prices do not always go up, which is what has happened in Australia. Because if we don't get people's head around the idea that housing prices always go up, we'll always get this over-allocation of wealthy people into housing markets, and that will drive price.
And that definitely is what has to shift in Australia for sure, that incredible expense of housing. It's a very interesting idea. And how far have you progressed it? The concept or the idea was released yesterday at the UDIA National Congress in Melbourne, and so far the amount of attention that it's had in news media has been absolutely amazing. And again, I think it's not just because it sounds like an interesting idea. There's this new realisation that housing cost is way too high and something needs to be done. And I think we're all looking for some projects and programs that can begin to pierce the bubble. And the key is not just affordability but availability too. Brian Haratsis, thank you very much for joining us on Life Matters this morning to tease this one out. I'll be interested to see what people think.
Thanks, Natasha.
Brian Haratsis there, he is Managing Director of Microplan Australia, where he is also Chief Economist. What do you think of this? What do you think fundamentally will shift the crisis, genuine crisis of housing affordability in Australia? And Brian's focus there is on housing purchasing rather than renting. Both are an issue here in Australia. Get in touch, our listener feedback line 02 833 1430, 02 833 1430.